Sophia had always lived a life of privilege, surrounded by luxury and wealth. Growing up in a grand estate, she had everything a girl could wish for: fine clothes, private tutors, and extravagant parties. Yet, beneath all the opulence, there was always a lingering feeling that she was different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the subtle distance her adoptive parents maintained, the quiet whispers among relatives, and the way her siblings were favored in little ways had never escaped her notice. Despite these silent doubts, Sophia did everything she could to earn her family's love. She excelled in her studies, behaved gracefully in social gatherings, and never once stepped out of line. But no matter how hard she tried, she always felt like an outsider in her own home. Her adoptive mother would shower her brothers and sisters with affection. Yet with Sophia, it was as if there was an invisible wall between them. Her father, though not unkind, was distant, treating her more as a responsibility than a daughter. The truth came out one evening in the most unexpected way. She had been passing by the study when she overheard her parents talking in hushed voices. At first, she hesitated, not wanting to eavesdrop, but the mention of her name stopped her in her tracks. Pressing herself against the door, she listened as her mother sighed in frustration, saying they had done enough by raising someone who wasn't even their own blood. Her heart pounded as she pieced together the words. She was adopted. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The walls of the home she had known her whole life suddenly felt unfamiliar. How could they have kept this from her? Had she ever truly belonged here? For a moment, she thought back to all the times she had felt different, the times she had been left out or treated with a certain detachment. It all made sense now. From that day forward, everything changed. The subtle distance her family had always kept from her became more apparent. Where there had once been cold indifference, there was now outright rejection. She was no longer included in important family discussions. Her opinions were brushed aside, and the warmth she had spent her whole life chasing disappeared completely. Her siblings, who had once played with her, started treating her as if she were a stranger. Even the household staff, who took their cues from the family, became less attentive. She no longer felt like a part of them. She was an outsider, a burden they had taken in out of obligation. And now that she knew the truth, they no longer saw the need to pretend. Each day became lonelier, the walls of the mansion closing in on her. The place she had once called home had turned into a gilded cage, and she realized with a sinking heart that she was completely and utterly alone. The decision was made without her consent. One evening, Sophia was called into the study, where her adoptive parents sat with solemn expressions. Her father wasted no time getting to the point. She was to be married. The words hit her like a blow, leaving her momentarily breathless. She searched their faces for some sign of hesitation, some hint that they would reconsider. But all she saw was cold determination. Her mother spoke next, explaining that the arrangement had already been made. The man, Daniel, came from a humble background, someone they considered beneath their status. Sophia was confused. If he was poor, why had they chosen him? The answer was as cruel as it was simple. They no longer wished to carry the burden of an adopted daughter. In their eyes, she had no real claim to their wealth or name, so marrying her off to someone insignificant was the easiest way to be rid of her. She protested, her voice shaking as she pleaded with them to reconsider. She promised she would make herself useful, that she would stay out of their way, anything but this. But her words meant nothing to them. Her mother dismissed her outburst with an impatient wave of her hand, while her father simply reminded her that she owed them for everything they had given her. "You should be grateful we found someone willing to marry you at all," he said, his tone final. Tears burned in her eyes as she realized she had no choice. If she refused, she would have nowhere to go. The thought of leaving the only home she had ever known, even with all its cruelty, terrified her. With a heavy heart, she fell silent, understanding that her fate had been sealed. The wedding preparations began immediately, but there was no joy in them. Unlike the grand celebrations her siblings had enjoyed, hers was rushed and devoid of any warmth. There were no lavish decorations, no excited chatter about bridal gowns or future happiness. Instead, it felt like a transaction, one they wanted to conclude as quickly as possible. Her wedding dress was simple, chosen without much thought. The guest list was short, with only a few family acquaintances invited. Even her mother, who had once taken great pride in hosting extravagant events, seemed uninterested. It was clear that this was not a moment of celebration, but an obligation they were eager to fulfill. On the day of the wedding, Sophia stood before the mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes, once filled with dreams, now held nothing but resignation. She had imagined love, a marriage built on mutual respect and understanding. But now she was walking into the unknown, bound to a man she had never met, with no idea what her future would hold. As she made her way to the ceremony, she felt utterly alone. Her heart ached, but no one noticed. No one cared. And just like that, with vows spoken without feeling, Sophia was married off, discarded like an unwanted possession. Sophia had braced herself for the worst. As she walked toward the modest ceremony, she imagined her groom as a man beaten down by poverty, someone desperate enough to accept a marriage to an unwanted woman. Her adoptive family had made it clear. Daniel was poor beneath their status, someone unworthy of their attention. If they had chosen him, he must have been the only one willing to take her. When she first laid eyes on him, she was taken aback. He was nothing like she had expected. Dressed simply yet neatly, Daniel carried himself with quiet confidence. He wasn't overly tall or strikingly handsome, but there was something about his composed demeanor that unsettled her. He did not look at her with pity or greed, but with an expression she couldn't quite place, calm, observant, and unreadable. Their wedding was a quiet affair, devoid of grandeur. Unlike the lavish ceremonies she had seen for her adoptive siblings, there were no extravagant decorations, no endless rows of guests, no festive music filling the air. The room was sparsely filled, her family barely making an effort to seem interested. The vows were spoken quickly, and before she fully processed it, she was married. Throughout the ceremony, Daniel remained respectful. He did not reach for her hand unless necessary, nor did he attempt to force warmth into a situation that clearly lacked it. Sophia found herself puzzled. She had expected indifference, or perhaps even resentment. After all, he had also been forced into this marriage. Instead, he treated her with a quiet dignity that made her feel strangely safe, even in the middle of her misery. When it was time to leave, her adoptive family wasted no time in saying their goodbyes. Her mother barely met her eyes, her father gave a curt nod, and her siblings showed no emotion. In a matter of minutes, she was escorted away from the only home she had ever known, a house that had never truly been hers. The journey to Daniel's home was silent. She didn't know what to say, and he didn't push her to speak. Her hands trembled in her lap, her mind racing with uncertainty. What kind of life awaited her now? Would she spend the rest of her days struggling, scraping by in hardship? When they finally arrived, her breath caught in her throat. She had expected a tiny, crumbling house, perhaps even a shared space with others. Instead, the house, while simple, was well kept and surprisingly comfortable. The furniture was modest, but carefully arranged, the kitchen neatly stocked, and there was a warmth in the air that contrasted sharply with the coldness of her childhood home. Daniel turned to her, his voice steady, yet kind. "This is your home now, Sophia. You don't have to be afraid." His words, though gentle, unsettled her. There was something about him, something more than what he allowed her to see. And as she stepped inside, she realized her new life was just beginning, but she had no idea what it would bring. The first few days of marriage felt like stepping into an entirely different world. Sophia had been raised in luxury, where servants catered to every need, where meals were prepared by professional chefs, and where she never had to lift a finger for household chores. But here, in Daniel's home, things were different. There were no maids, no lavish decorations, no expensive silks or jewelry adorning the space. Everything was simple, practical, and well-maintained, yet it lacked the grandeur she had always known. At first, she found even the smallest tasks overwhelming. Cooking, cleaning, and even drawing her own bath felt foreign to her. She fumbled in the kitchen, unsure how to prepare a meal from scratch. The first time she attempted to make tea, she nearly burned herself. Daniel had walked in at that moment, his expression unreadable, as he silently took the kettle from her and finished the task himself. Despite her struggles, Daniel never scolded or mocked her. He simply observed, offering help only when necessary. His patience unnerved her. She had expected frustration, or at least a hint of irritation, but he showed neither. In fact, there was something about his demeanor that confused her. Unlike what she had assumed about poor men, he was neither desperate nor insecure. He carried himself with an ease that didn't match the modest life he supposedly led. As days passed, Sophia started noticing small inconsistencies. While the house was simple, certain things stood out. His clothes were well tailored, his watch looked expensive, and his bookshelves were lined with rare titles she had only seen in wealthy estates. The furniture, though not extravagant, was of high quality, and the pantry was always well stocked with the finest ingredients. Her suspicions grew when she saw him handling documents late at night. He quickly put them away when he noticed her watching, his expression carefully guarded. But Sophia wasn't naive. She had grown up around powerful people, and she recognized the way he carried himself. He wasn't a man beaten down by poverty. There was something more to him, something he wasn't telling her. One evening, she finally confronted him, her voice laced with curiosity and frustration. "Who are you, Daniel?" she asked, crossing her arms as she watched him carefully. "You're not just some poor man my family found, are you?" For a moment, he didn't answer. His gaze met hers, unreadable as ever, before he gave her a small, almost amused smile. "You assume too much," he said simply, before turning away. Sophia's frustration grew. There was a mystery surrounding her husband, and she was determined to uncover it. But for now, all she could do was watch and wait, knowing deep down that the man she'd been forced to marry was not who he pretended to be. Sophia's suspicions grew with each passing day. At first, she had ignored the small details, the way Daniel spoke with quiet authority, the confidence in his posture, the way he never seemed worried about finances despite their supposedly modest lifestyle. But soon, the inconsistencies became too glaring to overlook. One evening, as she was tidying up, her eyes fell on his wristwatch. It was sleek and elegant, the kind only the wealthiest could afford. She recognized the brand. It was one her adoptive father used to wear, a limited edition model that cost more than most people earned in a year. How could a poor man afford such a thing? Then there were the late-night business calls. At first, she assumed they were related to his job, but she began to notice how he always stepped away when speaking, lowering his voice as if he didn't want her to hear. Whenever she tried to listen in, he would end the call abruptly or switch the topic. His conversations weren't those of a struggling man. They were sharp, calculated, and filled with a certain authority she couldn't ignore. His absences were even stranger. Some nights, he would leave without explanation, disappearing for hours before returning as if nothing had happened. When she asked where he had been, he gave vague responses. Meetings, errands, things that never quite added up. Her curiosity soon turned into determination. She began watching him more closely, noting the way he handled documents, the way he carried himself in public. He never hesitated when speaking to important people, never seemed intimidated by wealth or power. It was as if he belonged in that world. One afternoon, while cleaning their room, she found a locked drawer in his study. It was the only one that required a key, and that alone made her suspicious. Her fingers hovered over it, her heart pounding. if she could just see what was inside. Before she could try, she heard the front door open. Quickly, she stepped away, pretending to be occupied with something else. Daniel walked in, his gaze briefly flickering to the drawer before settling on her. His expression was unreadable, but she knew he had noticed. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind raced with questions. Who exactly was Daniel? Why was he hiding so much from her? If he wasn't the poor man her family thought he was, then why had he agreed to this marriage in the first place? One thing was certain. Her husband was not who he claimed to be, and Sophia was determined to find out the truth, no matter what it took. Sophia could no longer ignore the questions swirling in her mind. The clues were everywhere. The expensive watch, the business calls, the way he carried himself with quiet authority. Her husband was not a poor man. But who was he really? And why had he hidden the truth from her? One evening, when Daniel left the house without explanation, Sophia decided to follow him. Her heart pounded as she kept a safe distance, weaving through the dimly lit streets. She expected him to go somewhere modest, a small business or a gathering of common workers. But instead, he entered an upscale hotel, the kind reserved for the city's elite. From a hidden corner, she watched in shock as he was greeted with deep respect. Men in expensive suits nodded in recognition, some even stepping aside as he passed. He didn't act like an outsider. He belonged there. A concierge handed him a key, speaking in hushed tones, and Daniel disappeared into a private lounge. Sophia's mind reeled. This wasn't just a case of a secret side job or hidden savings. Daniel was wealthy, far wealthier than her adoptive family had ever imagined. As she stood there, frozen in disbelief, memories began surfacing, small moments that she had overlooked. The way he never hesitated in conversations with influential people, the knowledge he possessed about business and finance, his calm reaction when meeting her wealthy relatives. He had never been intimidated by power, because he had power of his own. But then, why had he chosen to live modestly? A deeper realization hit her. Daniel had known about her forced marriage from the beginning. He hadn't just been some desperate man willing to take her in. He had accepted the marriage on his own terms, for his own reasons. Was this some kind of test? Had he wanted to see if she could survive without wealth? Or was there a darker reason, something from his past that made him hide his fortune? Torn between confrontation and patience, Sophia returned home, her mind in turmoil. She wanted answers, but she also wanted to understand him first. If he had chosen to keep this secret, there had to be a reason. Lying in bed that night, she stared at the ceiling, her heart heavy with questions. Should she demand the truth? Or should she wait and see if Daniel would trust her enough to reveal it himself? One thing was clear. Her husband was not the man she had thought he was, and whatever his reasons were, they were far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Sophia could no longer keep the questions locked inside. That night, as Daniel sat in his study, lost in thought, she stepped forward, her heart pounding. "We need to talk," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Daniel looked up, his expression unreadable as always, but she noticed the way his fingers briefly clenched. He knew this conversation was inevitable. "Who are you, Daniel?" she demanded. "No more secrets. No more half-truths. I followed you today. I saw where you went. You're not poor. You never were. Why did you agree to this marriage? Why did you let me believe I was married off to a struggling man when you're clearly nothing of the sort?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a quiet sigh, he leaned back, his gaze steady. "I suppose I should have expected this," he murmured. "You've always been observant." She crossed her arms, waiting. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I come from a wealthy family," he admitted. "A very wealthy one. But wealth has always been both a blessing and a curse. I've seen people change because of money, become greedy, selfish, entitled. I've seen love turn into transactions, My own family is proof of that. Sophia frowned, listening intently. I built my own fortune, separate from my family's, but I wanted to live differently. I wanted to find someone who would see me for who I was, not for the money I had. He looked at her, his expression softer now. When I heard about your situation, about how you were being forced into marriage simply because you weren't worthy in their eyes, I saw a chance. I agreed to this marriage, not because I needed a wife, but because I wanted to give you a choice, a life where you wouldn't be treated as a burden. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. You knew? Daniel nodded. I knew everything. I knew your family cast you aside because you weren't their blood. I knew they didn't care where you ended up as long as you were out of their sight. And I knew that if I revealed my wealth from the start, they would have treated you differently, perhaps even tried to take you back. Sophia's chest tightened. All her life, she had fought to be accepted, to prove that she belonged. And yet, in the end, it had taken a stranger, her own husband, to show her that she had always deserved better. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. So this was all a test? Daniel shook his head. No, Sophia, this was never a test. This was me wanting to know you as you are, not as someone molded by wealth or expectation. And I wanted you to know that you were worth more than how they treated you. A wave of emotions crashed over her. Anger at her adoptive family, disbelief at the depth of Daniel's deception, but most of all, something unexpected. Gratitude. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen her, not out of duty, but out of belief in her worth. And in that moment, she realized her family had made the biggest mistake of their lives. News of her adoptive family's downfall reached Sophia sooner than she expected. Whispers of their financial ruin spread quickly. Bad investments, failed business deals, and reckless spending had finally caught up to them. The same family that had once looked down on her, treating her as an outsider, was now drowning in desperation. At first she felt nothing. No sympathy, no regret, only a quiet sense of justice. One afternoon, as she sat by the window, sipping tea in Daniel's grand yet tastefully modest home, a servant entered. "Madam, there are guests here to see you," he said hesitantly. "They say they are your family." Sophia smirked, setting her cup down. "Family," she echoed. "That's interesting." Curious, she rose to her feet and made her way to the drawing room where they waited. Her adoptive parents and siblings sat anxiously, their once proud faces now lined with worry. Their expensive clothes looked slightly worn, their usual arrogance replaced with nervousness. It was a sight she had once dreamed of seeing. Her adoptive mother was the first to speak. "Sophia, dear," she began, her voice unnaturally sweet. "It's been so long. We've missed you." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Have you?" she asked, her tone calm but cutting. Her father cleared his throat. "Listen, things have been difficult for us lately. We've had some setbacks. Business isn't what it used to be." "We were hoping you could help," one of her brothers added quickly. "You know, since we are family and all." Sophia almost laughed at the audacity. Family. The same family that had discarded her like an unwanted possession. The same people who had forced her into marriage just to rid themselves of the burden of her existence. She leaned back in her chair, studying them. "I see. And how exactly do you expect me to help?" Her mother hesitated. "Well, your husband. He may not be wealthy, but perhaps he has connections. Maybe he can speak to someone, find a way to help us recover." They still believed Daniel was poor. They had no idea that the man they had cast her off to was wealthier than they had ever been. Sophia took a deep breath, savoring the moment. She could expose the truth right now. She could watch their faces crumble as they realized the extent of their mistake. But she didn't need to. Their suffering was already its own punishment. With a serene smile, she stood up. I'm sorry, she said, feigning regret. Daniel and I live a very simple life. We don't have the kind of wealth or influence you're looking for. Her father's face darkened. Sophia, please. But she had already turned away. I'll have the servants show you out, she said over her shoulder. As they left, she watched them go, a quiet satisfaction settling in her chest. Karma had done its work, and for the first time in her life, she was truly free. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia sat in the garden, lost in thought. The encounter with her adoptive family had left her with a strange mix of emotions: satisfaction, disbelief, and something deeper, something unsettling. Daniel joined her, his presence always steady and reassuring. He didn't speak at first, simply watching her as she turned a delicate flower between her fingers. They came to you for help, he finally said, his voice calm. And you sent them away. Sophia sighed. They never cared for me, Daniel. Not truly. I was a burden to them, a problem they needed to solve. Now that they're suffering, they suddenly remember I exist. Daniel studied her carefully. So, what now? Do you want them to suffer, or do you want to help them? She exhaled slowly, conflicted. I don't know, she admitted. A part of me wants to let them drown in the mess they created. It would be justice, wouldn't it, after everything they put me through? Daniel nodded. It would be. But justice and revenge aren't the same thing. She turned to face him. You think I should help them? I think you should decide what kind of person you want to be, he said simply. They never gave you love. But does that mean you should withhold kindness? Or would walking away forever be the real freedom you deserve? Sophia thought about it for a long time. Would helping them make her weak? Would it make her just like them, desperate to prove herself? Or was true strength in choosing to forgive, not for their sake, but for her own peace? The next day, she made her decision. She arranged a meeting in a neutral place, away from the luxury of her home, away from the memories of her past. When her adoptive family arrived, they looked hopeful, expectant. Sophia remained composed. I've thought about your request, she said, her voice even, and I've come to a decision. Her father leaned forward eagerly. Yes, of course, dear. I'm not going to save you, she said firmly. Silence fell over the room. Her mother's face paled. Sophia, please, I'm not doing this out of revenge, she continued. I simply refuse to be used again. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them, just like I had to live with mine. Tears welled in her mother's eyes, and for the first time, Sophia saw something real. Regret. We were wrong, she whispered, about everything. We didn't realize. We didn't know what we had. Sophia gave a small, sad smile. And now you do, but it's too late. She stood, signaling the end of the conversation. I forgive you, she said softly, but I won't save you. As she walked away, she felt lighter than she ever had before. She had finally chosen herself, and that was the sweetest victory of all. As time passed, Sophia found herself reflecting on everything she had endured: the betrayal of her adoptive family, the unexpected truth about Daniel, and the difficult choice she had made. Yet through it all, she had emerged stronger, no longer a woman seeking validation from those who had never truly loved her. Daniel had been her greatest surprise. What had begun as a forced marriage, filled with resentment and uncertainty, had blossomed into something beautiful, something real. He had seen her worth even when she hadn't, had given her a life not built on wealth, but on respect and choice. And now, standing beside him, she realized she had finally found something she had never known before. Home. One evening, as they stood on their balcony overlooking the city, Daniel reached for her hand. Do you regret it? He asked. Choosing to walk away? Sophia smiled, lacing her fingers with his. No, she said softly. For the first time in my life, I feel free. She had let go of the past, not out of hatred, but because it no longer defined her. The family that had discarded her had faced their downfall, not because she had wished it upon them, but because greed had its consequences. They had placed their faith in wealth, only to lose everything. And she, the daughter they had never truly wanted, had found a life far richer than they could have ever imagined. It was a lesson written by fate itself. She turned to Daniel, her heart full. I used to think that destiny was something others decided for us, she admitted, that we had no control. But now I see that we make our own choices, and those choices shape who we become. Daniel smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Then let's keep making the right ones. Together. Sophia nodded, knowing that whatever came next, she was no longer alone. As the night breeze swept around them, she realized the greatest truth of all. Appearances could be deceiving. A poor man could be the wealthiest soul. A family could be bound by blood, yet empty of love. And a woman who was once cast aside could rise, not through revenge, but by choosing herself. With a final glance at the horizon, she whispered, "This is just the beginning." And indeed, it was.